For years, I had more than an hour spent in the car each day driving to and from work. For quite a while, I listened to music during that drive. While I enjoy listening to music, I quickly discovered that there were podcasts that might be more interesting for the time I spent in the car. A friend recommended that I try listening to a podcast called This American Life. And from the personal interest stories told in This American Life, I quickly found other podcasts that were similar to it in the storytelling or the content that was explained in each podcast. From This American Life, I found that BBC World News had a podcast that I could listen to catch up on what was going on in the world. While these are really interesting podcasts and still things that I listen to this day, I discovered that there were podcasts that matched my interests outside of both school and anything I had done up to that point in my life. I found a podcast that was a real play Dungeons & Dragons podcast. While I knew nothing about Dungeons & Dragons, I found the idea interesting, and I began listening to the podcast and from there discovered that I enjoyed playing with a group of friends. Along with a Dungeons & Dragons podcast I listened to, I found a podcast from the Dice Tower that explained board games, explained games that had come out previously, games that were coming out soon, and rated different board games. These two podcasts, both Real Play Dungeons & Dragons and The Dice Tower, sparked a real interest that continues. I love playing board games as well as role-playing games with my friends, and I've begun finding ways to incorporate both of those into my classroom. As I researched and tried to figure out how to incorporate role-playing games or board games into my classroom, I found Breakout EDU, a community of people that create escape rooms in the classroom using the content that they teach. I've completed more than 30 escape rooms now in my life, and I've designed at least 5 different escape rooms in the classroom, both for my students and for students of teachers that I work with. I've also incorporated board games. After seeing chess taught to some students in my program, I decided to research other strategy board games that I might be able to incorporate into my teaching. I've used games like Risk, Dominion, Ticket to Ride as different ways to teach my students strategic thinking, planning ahead, creativity, as well as the 21st century skills students need as far as cooperation, and just the ability to accept something that is out of their control. I found a dissertation that focused on using Dungeons & Dragons in education, and I used that to build a lesson of my own where I had students going through different Greek mythology, myths, to complete a campaign where I was able to incorporate the skills that they were taught in the classroom into the campaign they used in my classroom. And I've also been able to use problem-based learning to incorporate all or at least multiple content areas in one lesson, so that the things that students are learning separately are able to be brought into one lesson where they use all of those things and put those different ideas and skills together. In Warren Berger's book, A More Beautiful Question, he discusses how impactful one small change can be. He says rather than haphazard changes or decisions, a thoughtful and considered decision is a very practical way to bring change into your life. I think this is true in my classroom as well. The lessons I mentioned earlier started with a lot of careful work that was necessary for me to be able to teach those lessons successfully. These changes in my teaching were great both for me and for my students. My passions and my curiosity outside of the classroom brought energy to my teaching and excited my students. The lessons I was able to teach incorporated the things that I am most interested in personally and have been some of the most exciting and successful lessons for my students that I've taught. Carefully crafting a lesson where students learn and use all of the standards I need to teach by solving the puzzles in an escape room or leading their character through a Dungeons & Dragons type campaign is difficult. However, the effort is rewarded when students show mastery of a new content and enjoy the learning while they're in my classroom. But all of this has led to a question that's been growing in the back of my mind since I unlocked my first classroom 6 years ago. What can I do to make meaningful and lasting learning more fun? I have found that incorporating my interests and the questions I ask when I'm not working have been a great way to enhance my performance as an educator. it has also allowed me to create some of the most enjoyable lessons that I've seen my students participate in. These lessons, when they're carefully crafted and thoughtful, can be very educational for my students, and it does allow me to incorporate meaningful and lasting learning into an environment that they enjoy participating in more than anything else I've been able to teach before. But now, as I think about how to make lasting and meaningful learning more fun, I wonder how I can incorporate my students' interests as well as my own.